Hello and welcome to another episode of the Geo Interview. The digital economy is reshaping economic momentum, governance, and international relations. Technology with specific focus on artificial intelligence is increasingly influencing international as well as national governance and finance sectors. India's own Digital India initiative has transformed the nation's governance, making it effective and efficient for the public administration. The world is witnessing a digital race, bringing both unprecedented opportunities and risks. And to decode these various intricacies of this global digital renaissance, we welcome Mr. Yash Kalash, a research director of digital economy at the Center for International Governance Innovation. Good evening, Mr. Yash. How have you been?
Thank you, Digvijay. I'm doing well, joining in from Canada. Hope everything's all good in India today.
Of course, sir. Okay, so first things first, please explain to our audience what does digital economy mean and how would you analyze the contemporary global order with the digital economy in center? Which nations are you seeing emerging as dominant forces while who are being losing the ground, so to speak?
Sure. Firstly, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be, called for this conversation with GEOSTRATA. As the research director of digital economy at CIGI, Center for International Governance Innovation in Canada, think tank, a lot of my work is on analyzing how emerging digital technology are transforming economies, governance systems, and international power structures. And that's how I define digital economy. It's a very overlapping word that covers a lot of different areas. It's hard to kind of focus on one niche in it, but it's an interesting space to be. What I like to say is that we're living through essentially a structural transition where the global digital economy is changing, right? So we're seeing geopolitical shifts, we're seeing new economic powers develop around the world, and all of this questions the key areas of our economy: competitiveness, sovereignty, diplomacy. How do we look at all of these? How do we define these concepts? So it's a lot about the digital race between different countries. And where the contemporary world order, at least in my opinion, is really developing is that you have two clear, emerging spaces. So one is geopolitical, where you're seeing the rise of, or the resurgence of Russia, the rise of China. Obviously, the US is still the main behemoth on the global stage, but you're also seeing the rise of India. And as far as our discussion today, it's on the digital economy. So I think what I would look at when I look at the digital economy is replace Russia with the European Union. The European Union is a much more powerful, poignant force in this space. And each of them brings something different together, right? So the US is this dominant power with its foundational prowess in entrepreneurship, with its Silicon Valley startups and very strong private sector driven innovation culture. You're seeing the rise of China with its state-led model, state-centric development of technologies, private sector playing sort of a follower role in that. India is a very interesting third model. India has been very recently, actually, with its India stack and foundational technologies like UPI, Aadhaar, etc., has been the state-led innovative model, but it's the private sector which is innovating on top. So giving it really market freedom to do what it needs to do to scale. And the European Union, on the other hand, is this fourth pole, I would say, in this spectrum. But in some ways, it's a diminishing pole, actually. If you see, innovation itself is a challenge for the EU right now. Where it's very strong is with its privacy laws, with its regulatory architecture like GDPR, etc., consumer protection. That's where its strength lies. And that's where you're seeing these four different powers develop in the global architecture today.
Right, and it's actually very interesting to see that four different power architectures are developing around the world, which means that there is much scope for a greater integration between these four power structures as well, because we've seen that the Europeans are very good at the regulations, right? They are leading the regulations across the globe. Different parliaments across the world are debating on regulations that the Europeans are making. We are, let's say, dependent, or rather, we are taking notes from the American innovation. We are seeing a mixed model in India itself, and we are having a state-led model from China. That is the top-down approach from them.
Right.
Now, in what significant ways do you see technology influencing the international framework for public policy, and how are these advancements reshaping the framework of global governance?
Right. So I think that's a good question, right? So I think technology is now central to the architecture of global governance, right? Technology, to some extent, you can see as an extension of political power on the global stage. Most countries are using it, to increase their influence, to demand more, especially from the global south. So from, whether it's digital trade, it's taxation, cyber diplomacy, we're seeing new policy frameworks coming up. They're getting redefined in real time because these technologies are very fast moving. What's interesting is that multilateral institutions, which have been so central to the global order, like the G20, like the Bretton Woods institutions, like IMF, World Bank, WTO, etc., they're under pressure, right? They're slow to adapting to a world where data is at the core and not just capital or goods. Um, it's the core economic driver. And technology, to some sense, is also enabling new governance models domestically, right? So we're seeing, rise of digital ID, like I mentioned, Aadhaar in India, algorithmic policy tools, smart contracts. How, but all of this means is that different countries are creating their own ecosystem, which is obviously going to fragment the global order. And we're seeing that in some cases as nations pursue digital sovereignty, build walls around their digital ecosystem to protect it. And where that's going to lead to is divergent regulatory standards. So in today's world, the real question to ask is how can we bring together these countries, harmonize, if not create interoperability between these different regulatory standards and technology. And the central question to all of this is the governance architecture that we have today of these institutions, do they have the capacity to deal with this change, or do we need new institutions? So that's a very important question to ask today.
Right. I think adaptability, when paired with innovation, can maybe, let's say, open a new dimension in this regulatory framework and the digital space.
Yeah.
Now, when you name these four nations that you named just a while ago, who are according to you at the forefront of the technological race, in your opinion, can you maybe delve deeper into what national level policies or frameworks in economy and governance supports their stature in the world?
Yes, for sure. Let's start with the foremost power, right? The US. Uh, Obviously, with the new Trump administration, putting cutting edge innovation at the center of their domestic policy has been quite important. You've just seen the Genius Act, which essentially legalizes the framework around stablecoins in the crypto space, come to the fore in, I think it's only pending presidential signature in the United States. So there's that. You've got the CHIPS Act, to increase semiconductor capacity and AI development in the US. And similarly, you're seeing in China, you're seeing made in China, similar to what Make in India has been, heavy investments going into AI and robotics. India, of course, has had its own Digital India initiative, which the government has been very heavy on. The India Stack development with its blueprint on digital transformation. And then the Europeans have their Digital Markets Act, GDPR. You're seeing a lot of these different models come out. And even, you can go beyond these four powers really and look at, areas like the ASEAN, the Southeast Asian grouping of nations. They have their Digital Economic Framework Agreement, DEFA, which is another model to integrate the regulatory architecture around these countries. So every country is trying to develop its own architecture, and it's fundamental to their domestic policies as well.
Right, and I think most of it is driven by their national priorities because, let's say, for China, it's to make sure that they are able to catch up with the Western world. For West, it's about safeguarding the individual rights of their citizens, and for India, I think it's more uh, it's keeping its citizens at the center while also making sure that the private sector does not fall behind, right? The government
Yeah.
cannot always invest in these technologies and then see that other people are taking benefits of it.
Yeah. And one more thing I'd add to all of that is that there is this sheer understanding of competition, right? Nobody wants to be left behind.
Yeah.
And if you don't build your own ecosystem, you will be left behind to some extent, or, at the mercy of diffusion of these technologies coming from the global leaders, like the US or China. And the real question to ask is, for example, let's say in India, would you want the same norms that China induces into its technologies to be the diffusive technology framework in your own country? Is that not a threat to your national security? So that's an important part of it, and that competition question is very important in this whole race for digital supremacy.
Yeah, that's a very excellent point that you've made. Now, considering India's own digital revolution with its Digital India initiative, how has this program, in your opinion, transformed governance and finance sectors effectively over the past a decade or so? And where does India stand among peers globally?
Yes, for sure. So India's digital transformation journey is not new. It's been going on for a few decades. Let's at least 2 decades, if not more. It began with Aadhaar, our digital identity program. It moved to payments with the UPI. Then services were built on top. You've got DigiLocker, DigiYatra, and now you're looking at commerce and health initiatives coming through. ONDC is an example of all of that. And what's been unique about the Indian ecosystem is that they're all interoperable, right? They're low cost and they're made for scale. They're made to cater to 1.5 billion Indians, and the next 500 million who will be joining the internet revolution in India. What this has done has essentially it's increased states' capacity, to provide services to those at the bottom of the pyramid, let alone, within the metro cities. It's also reduced leakages. So, when you think of cash transfers to those at the bottom of the pyramid, to increase financial inclusion, these kind of technologies like UPIs, made that much more scalable today and tenable. Obviously, that means that welfare delivery is far more astute today. So where that transformation is arriving is that India is now being able to export this DPI as a tool. We saw that under India G20 leadership that it wanted to take it to Africa, to Southeast Asia, potentially all the way to Latin America, and take these technologies to even the global north, right? With partnerships with France and other more developed economies like the UAE and Singapore. Where the real difference will lie, and this is where I think India will have a cutting edge going forward, is if the Indian government will be able to incentivize its private sector to take a lot of this technology abroad. Right now, it's state sponsored. It's the private sector which needs to do that export of these technologies. Currently, India's private sector is heavily focused on Indian consumption, so it creates products and services which cater to its domestic audience. The day it's able to do it for the global audience and really focus on global consumption, the export of this technology will be far more outreaching and better at cost as well. So I think that's going to be an interesting one. In terms of its peers, I don't think today there is any other nation that can actually provide this cost-based, very advanced technology globally. You've got really good technology coming out from the US, but it's expensive. There's private sector led innovation there. It comes at market cost. China is, the ideological understanding of Chinese technology. A lot of people are not very skeptical about it. They're not very keen on, their value systems being put into or threatening their democratic tendencies in their countries. So that's a big challenge. And that's where India has a space to really innovate.
Right. I can conclude 2 points from here that domestically, I think governance structure has been strengthened more than the finance structure through Digital India Initiative, and globally, I think it's the finance structure, right? That the Indian diaspora can use the UPI, they can use the UPI to send money to their friends back home, right? And all of that stuff. And it's a very important point that you raised that India brings or rather comes at a meeting point when it comes to providing cost effective digital public infrastructure while also staying democratic or rather transparent in its approach, right?
Yes.
Now, do you believe the upcoming global contests among the nations will be for critical minerals essential for development of these critical and emerging technologies? And how do you assess the notion?
Well, yes, for sure. I think the critical minerals are, the fuel behind a lot of these technologies. We're seeing contests develop around, minerals like lithium, cobalt, rare earths, etc. And they're going to power our batteries, chips, quantum devices of the future. But the important part here is that it's not all just about extraction, right? It's about who controls the overall full spectrum of the supply chain, from extraction to refining to building, recycling capabilities. Uh, where nations like China, they're dominating certain parts of that supply chain. For example, refining. Other countries like India, the US, we're still playing catch up to a lot of that capability. There's a focus on building strategic reserves, processing capacities, etc. And that's where, we see that this race is highly geopolitical. Countries with more influence, the capability to invest in foreign nations will persevere. An important part of this conversation is also something that's often, missed in this geopolitical race is the ecological side, right? So the future of the supply chains will have to be green. It'll have to be ethical to some extent and resilient, right? Sustainability questions will be raised around the extraction of these use, the judicious use of these minerals, and for the overall benefit of society. And which countries are able to build the frameworks around that is going to be very important. And I think India has somewhat of an edge there as well. We are kind of opposed to that notion of colonial extractivism that we saw in the 19th and early 20th century, which foreign powers from the West did to fuel their industrial revolution. And I think the digital revolution will be far more, ecologically and sustainably focused as well here.
Right. Now, what factors should be prioritized by nations when drafting data privacy legislations? Like, additionally, and how can India's Digital Personal Data Protection Act be strengthened to safeguard itself from or its citizens from plausible cyber threats?
Yeah, for sure. What we're seeing globally, and this has been my experience. I just hosted the T7 summit, which is part of the G7 under Canada's presidency, and part of as the chair of the Digital Economy Task Force. Um, a lot of our work was on data. What we've seen is data minimization, purpose-based limitation on extraction of data from customers, transparency around the algorithms that are being used. Competition towards big tech, who generally are, the ones who have sort of monopoly over these algorithms and platforms, is some of the key fundamentals around this, right? Another one is cross-border data flow. We've seen the DFFT principles, data free for with trust coming out of the G20 and G7 thought processes recently. Need for tighter enforcement through the creation of new institutions which can address digital risk, which can address the notions of privacy and data are very important. And I think the final fundamental requirement is not really harmonization on a normative stance, but interoperability, so that regulations can engage with one another, systems can talk to another, technologies, which reduces compliance costs and makes, for example, in India's case, the DPDP Act, its compliance, Indian companies going abroad will need to comply to EU's GDPR. And for example, EU investing into India will require their companies to follow the DPDP Act. So having some good degree of convergence between the two acts will be very important for digital trade, right? So I think that's very important from that lens that you spoke about. The second part of your question in terms of cybersecurity, the notion of siloized creation of regulation is a big problem, right? So under DPDP, it's had a strong start, but what it needs is an independent data protection authority that brings together the different industries. Data will impact fintech, consumer, cyber technology, defense. We need the creation of an ICT-based, information communication technology-based act where the DPDP is at the center of it, which converges all these different regulations that are relatively siloed in our Indian system and converges them to create one national, ICT-focused data privacy protection act, which brings all of these technologies and consumers under it. So I think that is the only way to really create a national level strategy going forward.
Right. I think partners will have to converge and agree to some basic principles of data protection
Yes.
and its safeguard. Only then can they make such laws which are interoperable, or rather which can be harmonized, as you said, so that the different companies, or rather the businesses from across the world, can comply with them without much cost added to their operations, right?
Yes.
Now, are we witnessing a digital global race? Like, what do you think, and what are the potential future risks associated with this competition, and what measures should like have the potential to mitigate these risks?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we're no doubt, we're in a digital arms race today. The risks are poignant. We're looking at cyber warfare coming in, targeting critical infrastructure. And what is not critical infrastructure today? Your electricity grids, your hydrological systems like your dams, all the way to your internet, they're all critical for your economy, for your defense capability, for your society to run today into today's 21st century. So I think all of that is under the threat of cyber attacks and cyber warfare. The second risk that I can see is AI misuse, both with generative AI, but I think really the next stage of AI, super intelligence, artificial general intelligence, how that develops, what values does it incorporate, that will have the biases does it have, that will have a tremendous impact. And we're seeing, I just spoke about cyber warfare. I spoke about AI. We can talk about payment systems, being monopolized by countries to create tariffs and block another nation from going, participating in the global economy. As you've seen, the US removed Russia out of the SWIFT ecosystem. So every facet of digital technology has dual purpose, both civilian and military use or geostrategic use, and it's being used and abused by nations for their own geopolitical strategic interests. Now, to combat this, I think what's fundamental is that we need to have trust in our system, back in our multilateral institutions, and trust around our democratic norms, right? So we need to build multilateral cooperation. We need to build resilient digital infrastructures. We talked about harmonization and interoperability and consumer centricity. All of this needs to be embedded in our ethics and in our legal frameworks. We need to increase our digital literacy, right? There's a lot of people around the world who are not understanding of the technologies that they use and the risks around it. So that aspect needs to be catered to. And finally, I think we need common norms to be developed around cyber combat conduct. The way, for example, we've had regulations around the use of weapons in warfare. We need similar kind of architecture around the responsible use of these technologies. So I think it's very fundamental to the way we're moving forward.
Right, and that's a very important point that you raised regarding digital literacy, because when people don't know what they are signing up for, or their representatives are signing up for, they cannot question them, they cannot hold them accountable, right? We can't know that if a deal is being called off because of political pressure, or alleged it's a national security issue.
Yeah.
Right? So that is, I think, very important for nations and its people. And with that, we conclude this enriching and invaluable conversation, which we hope will be crucial in outreach to a greater audience in decoding important aspects of the emerging global digital age. We thank you, Mr. Yash, for taking time to speak with us, and it was a pleasure hosting you today. Looking forward to more such collaborations.
Thank you, Digvijay.